Cool. Sounds good. Yeah. I mean, so this is a question that I get a lot. Like I do a lot of like mentorship at Microsoft. We have these things called career jams where basically you can sign up and there's early in career people that sign up and like people see the career growth that I've had and they're always like, how did you achieve this? And so I think this would be a good topic just to kind of touch on like some of the things that I've internalized over the years that I think have helped me, especially early in my career, like stand out from my peers, just go the extra mile. And they're just things that like, I mean, nothing here I think is like difficult or like a huge tax or anything like that. It's just like a different way of kind of like thinking about things and framing it than college kind of sets us up for when we first get out of it. So I'll jump in, but basically like the first kind of bucket of things that I always like to talk about is just like advocating for yourself. I think when we come out of college, you know, at least when I came out of college, and a lot of early in career people I talk to, it's like they just are kind of like, hey, like the work I do speaks for itself, right? Like, and that's the model that we're ingrained in school, right? It's like, hey, I do great work, I submit it, I get the grade, and you know, life goes on. So like my work speaks for itself. And I think in a perfect world, like your work would speak for itself in the corporate world as well. But unfortunately, you know, the corporate world is messy. There is a lot of, you know, your manager can be busy. They might not understand your career growth, and therefore, you know, they might not be providing you with the right opportunities, even though their head is in the right place. And so one of the things that I internalized early on was just like, I want to, you know, make sure that my career goals are being made clear to my leaders. And at the time, like I didn't know how to benchmark myself other than promotions, because it's like you get a grade, like what's the equivalent of like an A in the corporate world? It's like getting promoted. And so I was always really aggressive with my leadership of just like, hey, like I would like to get promoted, you know, every year when I was junior. You know, is that feasible? And they'd be like, well, if you, you know, have the right opportunities and if you deliver against them, then like yes. And I was like, great, help me get the right opportunities. You know, I will deliver to the best of my ability. Give me the constant feedback I need to grow. And so that having those like open and honest conversations with my leaders, I think really helped because they were able to kind of understand like I was hungry, I wanted to grow, they'd give me the right opportunities. And as long as I could keep kind of proving that like, hey, I can execute against these, even as they get more and more complex, you know, it was a kind of, you know, win-win relationship on both sides. Mm-hmm. You know, and I think like the other thing that I'll say is just like keeping the customer outcome and the impact that you're driving in your mind at all times is also super helpful. Like I think early in career, it's easy to just kind of get lost on like, hey, these are the activities that I'm doing, right? Like, oh my gosh, I'm so busy. I've done all of these different things, but you could do, you know, 10 different things, but if they don't, you know, drive towards an actual like measurable outcome for the business, for the customer, come rewards time, it can be super challenging to be like, well, like what was the actual tangible impact that I had? So I'd say like, you know, always being able to kind of story tell that in the back of my mind of like, oh, I'm in this role, I have this opportunity, this is the outcome I'm accountable for, and like the work that I'm doing is accruing to that or not, in which case maybe I shouldn't be doing this, or maybe I should have a conversation with my manager about like where this is in terms of priority. You know, that I think is also really useful. And it kind of feeds back into the first thing I mentioned where, you know, at inflection points, right? After you ship something, after you've made that measurable impact, you can have that conversation with your manager of like, hey, I delivered this outcome. You know, these are the outcomes I see coming up next, but are those the most impactful things I could still be working on? Or should, you know, is there some other big meaty problem that the org is facing that I would be better suited to work on? And having that conversation was how like I shifted around, you know, as you probably heard in the intro, every year and a half, I'd say. And it was just because I'd always have that conversation of like, cool, I delivered this thing. Is this the right place for me to be, you know, long term if I still want to grow at the rate that I do? And more often than not, my leadership would be like, no, let's put you over here because this needs some help. Yeah. So that's kind of where I would say, you know, advocating, you know, comes into play. Couple other things I'll quickly share. One is just like always keeping in mind too that that the impact opportunity you have is appropriately time bound. Like I think sometimes leaders will be like, hey, I'm going to give you this, you know, super meaty area, but like the runway to be able to like build something and get it to customers is going to be like 2 years. And those types of opportunities, while they're great, super hard to, you know, if you're trying to get promoted every year, first year, you're going to be like, well, I laid a bunch of groundwork, I guess, but like I didn't really have the impact. So working with your manager to kind of understand like, hey, how can I decompose this? And if you can't, what else can you take on the side so that you do have something to talk about within that time frame, I think is also something that's super helpful. Which then gets me to the last point, which is like performance reviews. Something that surprised me about corporate world, but I'm actually really grateful for the opportunity now, is like my managers would often come to me and be like, hey, I need you to write your own performance review. And I was like, what? Like, don't you know what I did? But then I as I kind of internalized it, I was like, wow, like who better to represent the impact and all the, all the things that were driven over the past, period or the past year than me. So, being able to kind of like shape that narrative and work with your manager, I think is something that's really great. And, even if your manager is going to do it themselves, like being involved in the process at least and making sure that like what's being represented in performance reviews is accurate, I think is the last kind of thing that I would mention there to round out advocating for yourself.
Totally.
Yeah, so the next thing that I think really kind of helps is like adopting an ownership mindset and acting like an owner. And something that I have gotten consistent feedback on throughout my career is that just like, man, like you're willing to just like roll up your sleeves and do kind of whatever it takes to get things done. And I think that this is something like nobody likes to do, quote unquote grunt work, right? Like I remember when I was working on our feedback system, we had a backlog of 1,800 bugs. And we were my leadership was like, we don't know what the priority of these things are. They've been sitting around for like a year. There's probably some really bad ones that we need to go solve, but like we have no way of triaging these. And I remember being like, well, maybe I'll explore some automation. And I kind of looked around for a bit and was like, I can't find a way, like a criteria that would work across all these bugs. I just triaged them all. And it took me like a week and it was miserable. Like you're just like, your eyes are glazing over and stuff. But it's like at the end of the day, we had this, this list of like 50 bugs that were like really, really critical. And, solving those did lead to measurable outcomes. But like we never would have found those unless someone had just kind of done the work, right? Or like, I know other things that I commonly hear about and people are like, yeah, my data science team is swamped and I just can't get an answer from them on this like, telemetry that I need, like, and I need to be able to measure the impact. And it's kind of like, I mean, like there's Copilot now coming out, like there's plenty of resources online to like, learn a little bit of SQL, like SQL, and just like go in and write the queries yourself, right? Like don't wait. And so that I think is something like if you can kind of show that proactivity and just being like, hey, I have the impact that I'm trying to drive in mind. I know what needs to be done to hit that impact. And I there's no one else who's able to do it. Just being willing to roll up your sleeves and do it, I think is really, something that will set you apart for sure. Kind of rolling into that same point, being proactive about the opportunities. Like, I think this comes with experience, of course. When you're, super new in your career, you're probably not going to be super proactive about identifying things. But as you start to, find your rhythm, being able to just kind of like look around and see like, oh man, like this is a problem. Again, keeping that impact in mind of like, wow, this is something that no one's working on right now. Being able to bring that to your management and being like, hey, I noticed this problem. Are you okay if I go solve it? Really kind of helps build that trust, build, that, ownership mindset, both in yourself as well as like your leaders will view you as that, which I think also sets you up well for success. And then the last thing I'll say to just kind of round this section out is like, all of this requires the ability to prioritize well. So because like you can get lost in the weeds, like I said, doing all these activities, if they don't accrue to the ultimate outcome you're trying to drive, that can be, a challenge. And so I really love like the L&O framework. Shreyas Doshi, I think, was the one on Twitter that created this. But basically, thinking about tasks in terms of like what's high leverage, meaning if I put in 1.0 of effort, I get 10x, 10.0 outcome, versus what's a neutral task. I put in 1, I get 1 out, versus what's an overhead task. I put in 1 and I get 0.1 out. And, just being able to balance like and really kind of structuring your day around like, spend your deep focus time on those high leverage tasks, do a great job on them because those are the things that are getting you the most bang for your buck, versus something like, overhead tasks. Like, I love that his quote is like, actively try to do a bad job on them. They don't matter. Like, you can bang them out in like the 5 minutes you have between meetings and just like get them off your plate so you have more time to focus. So another thing that I usually like to share with folks who are kind of early in career and thinking about how do I prioritize. The next thing I'll talk about is people like people are way bigger than problems. I think in order to grow quickly, you need to build a reputation of accountability and trust. I think a lot of the things I already mentioned ladder up to that really well. But ultimately that just boils down to like when you say you're going to do something by a certain time, get it done. If you can't get it done, communicate early. And that'll just help kind of build that sense of like, hey, like you're trustworthy, and you're able to kind of take on more work and still execute against the outcome. The other thing I'll say is just like that I think is super important is bringing others along, right? So find opportunities to give back to the community, mentor people, share your learnings with your team, right? If you just went and learned a whole bunch about like SQL, chances are there's like 4 other PMs on the team that are also being like, oh, my data science team is overwhelmed. So, sharing those learnings broadly can help, not only, establish yourself as a leader, someone who's driving culture, but also just like helps you empower other people, which hopefully is rewarding, right? Of just kind of like, hey, like this is something that, you're able to give back to the broader PM community for. Totally. And then also like, just cultivating a network of advocates, I think is super important too, especially in this economy. Like the job market is difficult. So being able to like, and even at big companies, you're going to cross paths with people way more often than you think. And so, spending time building relationships with your engineering managers, your design managers, high level ICs, your leaders, all of that I think is important because like they're going to, go to different companies, they're going to go to different teams. And those are, as you grow more and more in your career, like, I mean, that's how I landed the Glint acquisition role, right? It was like, hey, I had this relationship with someone and they reached out to me. And so that network, I think, in cultivating that network and spending time on it is super important, if you want to grow quickly as well. And then I know we said 3 points. I'll do one more because this one is near and dear to my heart. And I've been told when I was especially going from like, the PM2 to senior band, this is the thing that really set me apart from folks. I had a deep love for culture. And so I started this program in Edge called Edge Squad. It was an early in career ERG, employee resource group. And I treated it like a product. And, it was like, hey, like I'd heard from people that were joining. I felt this myself, like, hey, there's like 200 early in career people on this team. And like, we're just trying to find other people that are like us. We're going through the same challenges, but there was no like programming, no networking, no ability for us to connect. And it was leading to like low, MPS. It was leading to, people that were saying like, hey, within the next 2 years, I'll probably find a new role. It was leading to like low onboarding scores. Like when you first onboarded, people were like, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know where I fit into this org. And so, again, treating culture like product, I think, was kind of this epiphany that I had where it's like, wait, like these early in career folks, they're kind of just like customers. I can talk to them and I can learn like, oh, what are your problems? What are your pain points? I can survey them and I can establish a baseline quantitatively of like, hey, these are, this is how you're feeling in terms of the number of connections you have at work. This is where your MPS is at. This is where you're, feeling in terms of your opportunities for career growth and development and your ability to like have conversations with leaders and things like that. And then once you have that corpus of data that shows that there's an opportunity, you can take it to your LT just like you would as a PM and say, hey, like I need some budget. I need to, pitch this to my leaders, secure the budget, piloting, new initiatives. Like we did, everything from like reverse mentorship sessions to like karaoke and bowling nights to like, ice cream socials. It was, we did like round tables, we called them, where it was like we could mentor each other type of thing. And we would always have surveys at the end of each thing where it was like, was this a good use of time? Right. And we do, every quarter, I think we do a pulse survey. So, we always kind of had a finger on the pulse of like, is MPS going up? Is attrition, risk going down? And, and then if we saw something that wasn't working, we'd pivot. And so this pitch, pilot, pulse, pivot thing, this is like in product as well. It's kind of the exact same. But this loop, I think, was super critical for, both evolving the culture, which was great. It was super rewarding, again, to kind of see the impact that was having. But also just for, when you're putting together your performance review and stuff like that, a lot of times, and a lot of people I would talk to is just like, it's really hard for me to say like, well, I focused on culture, but I can't really measure it. And it's like, you can. It takes a little extra work. But treating it like this way gives you, very clear metrics that you can give to yourself, to the, leader, the other early in career folks I had on like the leadership team around me. We all had very clear metrics that we could put on and say like, hey, as a result of this work, we improved, MPS by, 30 points or something like that. So, if culture is something that's near and dear to your heart as well, spending a little bit of time to think about how to run it like a product, drive those measurable outcomes, that I was told by multiple managers I had that like, hey, everyone else, you're performing about the same as everyone else. But when we think about promotions, the fact that you focused on this cultural aspect and actually had these tangible outcomes you were driving was kind of what tipped the scale in your favor. So yeah, that's my kind of crash course. I'm happy to answer questions. My LinkedIn is here as well, so feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to connect with folks in the community. But yeah, hopefully some of this was helpful.
Yeah, awesome presentation, Scott. I think so much of this resonates with my experience in the first few years as well. I wrote down a couple things that came to mind, but I'll go in order from the order you took. When you think about planning your impact and making sure you're working on the right things, what is the sort of process that you follow? For instance, one thing that's worked for me and is kind of write the review that you want to have written first, then figure out, okay, what do I have to work back towards to get there? I've also seen the other way where it's like, I want to focus on my business outcomes and then kind of layer up to that. I'm curious the process that you personally have been following for the last 10-ish years.
Yeah, it's very similar to that. Like I think basically thinking about like once you've had the conversation with your manager, you've understood, you're like, okay, here's the high impact space. Thinking a little bit about like you said, the outcome metrics, the OKRs, like what is that big thing that at the end of the year or something you want to be able to say like, hey, I drove this metric by this amount, or I did this, which led to this outcome. And then, like you said, working back and figuring out like, well, what are all the things that I need to be able to do to get there, right? It's like, oh, I need to be able to like, I need to work with my design team to like design this product, and I need to like make sure that I have the telemetry in place to like instrument this product in a way that like when I launch it, I can actually say I drove that outcome. So I think it's very similar. It's just like, thinking a lot at the onset about like what's the goal you want to drive and the outcome you want to be able to, be held accountable for, essentially, and then decomposing that down and working backwards to figure out like, okay, I'm here today. What's the timeline and what are the things I need to do to get there?
Yep. Yeah, I feel like, a big part of success is being intentional with how you spend your time, because also as PMs and with the diversity of things we can do, we get asked by people to go do all these different things. And, briefly touching right on the framework, LNO framework, it's like if you spin your wheels for weeks doing things that are impactful, you don't get to drive the result.
Yeah.
In the same idea, you mentioned like you need to take on big things that will take some time, and you need to have other things in there too, right? So something that's worked for me is is kind of trying to layer, right? Like in this, I'm delivering this and I'm in the research stage here. We're in the dev stage here and we're launching this. How do you think about your time management and your, we all have finite time. So how do you think about your percentage allocation to each one, and then identifying the right thing, to layer into here and later on?
Yeah, I think so. I'm very similar to you. I always try to have that similar layered impact where it's like, hey, there's some stuff that's in execution mode, and hopefully as PMs, like I think if we've done a good job, once it gets into execution mode, we can kind of go hands off. Like there'll be times where like design will have questions, you'll get pulled in, or like engineers will have questions about like trade-offs, and you'll have to get pulled in. But by and large, like I've noticed, usually when something gets in execution, you can come up for air a little bit. And so, like you said, then having more of that future looking stuff, the hypotheses that we haven't validated with customers yet, and like going and running the customer research at that point, or like doing some wireframes to like storytell around an idea that you have or something like that, or just like market research, all those things. Again, I think it comes down to I guess there's also like the urgency and importance kind of prioritization matrix, which is always going in my head as well.
Right.
Of like, if something is in execution mode and it blows up, generally that takes priority over the longer lead discovery stuff. But it's like usually you can kind of jump
Hmm.
in, make sure everything's smoothed over, jump back out, spend some more time on the discovery
Yeah.
stuff. So that's kind of how I think about it. Like definitely that layering concept, and then just again, kind of anytime there's a inflection point where you have to shift between them, just making sure that like, hey, is this the most important thing that I should be doing right now based on the
Hmm.
outcomes that I'm trying to drive? It's like, yep,
Hmm.
probably is. So yeah, jumping in and getting that done.
Yeah.